Real quick, it bothers me to learn that countless people's private info is being sold and shared by online data brokers. Not to worry, today's sponsor Delete Me makes it quick, easy, and safe to remove your personal data online, but more on that later. Blue lilies ran in drifts along the edge of the teepees, where children played and elders talked. The days of traditional gatherings on this stretch of prairie were coming to an end. These bands of Nimíipuu or Nez Perce people were making the last ride into exile. A treaty in 1855 had established the legal right of the Nez Perce to nearly all of their ancestral territory, but in 1860 Euro-Americans discovered gold in the region. Piece by piece, thousands of prospectors and miners plotted and carved the earth. Their coughing boomtowns anticipated a ceaseless migration of settlers, who staked homes, farms, and ranches in violation of the treaty. Steadfast allies of the United States, the Nez Perce were loath to retaliate and pleaded for diplomatic resolution. Careful to retain the gold mines and settlements, government representatives drew new borders in 1863, and convinced certain conciliatory Nez Perce leaders to sign a treaty forfeiting some 90% of their people's land. The wise Chief Joseph of the Wallowa Valley likened this to learning that your neighbor has sold away your horses without your permission. For the Nez Perce were composed of semi-autonomous bands, none of which possessed the authority to speak for all the others. Commissioners from the U.S. government conceded as much in 1873. If any respect is to be paid to the laws and customs of the Indians, then the Treaty of 1863 is not binding upon Joseph and his band. No such respect was paid. While most Nez Perce lived on the reservation, the outlying bands led by Joseph, ToHoolhoolzote, Looking Glass, and Whitebird remained peacefully on their homelands. It was only now in 1877 that the military threat from General Oliver Otis Howard compelled them to make for the reservation. Not everyone could stomach surrender. At night, a few young Nez Perce men recalled the depredations their people had suffered in years past. Trespassing settlers had stolen their cattle and horses, killed their men, assaulted their women, crimes largely overlooked by the American justice system. The three furious Nez Perce rode out to avenge the death of a relative. They struck homes and killed several men, then rallied 16 more Nez Perce warriors the next night. The raiders brutally attacked men, women, and children, killing around 15 settlers in all. Joseph, away from the camp during the raids, would admonish them and reflect. Our young men were quick-tempered, and I've had great trouble in keeping them from doing rash things. I know that my young men did a great wrong. Yet the actions of a few had produced a casus belli against the whole. General Howard sent over 100 men toward a canyon where most of the Nez Perce had moved camp. As some Nez Perce approached under a white flag, one of the U.S. volunteers shot at them. American soldiers dismounted and advanced toward the camp. The grassy hills then roiled with war cries. Some 60 Nez Perce sharpshooters emerged and hit kill shots, strategically targeting trumpeters and officers to break American cohesion. In the long retreat, the winding knolls were matted with dead soldiers. The Americans lost over 30 men without killing a single Nez Perce. The latter were capable warriors. They possessed well-bred Appaloosa horses, organized maneuvers with signals, emboldened themselves with taunts and songs, and lacking reliable access to ammunition, their gunners had learned to be extremely accurate. Howard, fearing that others would join Joseph and the defiant bands, ordered the arrest of the neutral chief Looking Glass and his people. Villagers fled as U.S. cavalry attacked, plundered their homes, and stole 600 horses. Neutrality shattered, in early July, Looking Glass and his band joined Joseph and the others, who had skirmished with troops and raided abandoned farms since their victory at the canyon. Joined by some Palouse allies, the combined party numbered roughly 800 people, around 250 of whom were men of fighting age. The caravan held off an attack by Howard, then vanished into the precarious Bitterroot Range of the Rockies. Arranging safe passage with local troops, The miles-long column cut through mountains and into the Bitterroot Valley. The people, their food, teepees, and weapons borne by 2,000 horses. Some Nez Perce had periodically trekked across these mountains for the bison hunt and built alliances with indigenous peoples of the Great Plains. Lookingglass now assured his fellow chiefs that they could journey east and find assistance among the Crow, with whom some Nez Perce had once fought side by side against the Sioux. Lewis and Clark emerged from this same route 7 decades ago. The Nez Perce had fed the starving Americans, and on the way home the expedition stayed with them for over a month, during which time the peoples pledged friendship. Early French-Canadian traders referred to numerous local peoples as Pierce-to-Nose or Nez Perce, a term later anglicized and specifically applied to the Nimíipuu, who incidentally had largely abandoned nose piercing. The Nez Perce continued to dwell among their rivers, mountains, and prairies, in teepees and larger lodges made of reed mats or bison hides. Salmon was fundamental to their diet, supplemented by hunted game and wild plants. Beyond plain buckskin clothes, the Nez Perce produced striking garments. Women wore basket hats, colorful dresses, and jewelry. Men possessed similar adornments and sacred war shirts. The people believed themselves guided by spiritual guardians called Wayakin. As many adopted Christianity, others pursued the Dreamer faith, whose prophets preached that divine deliverance was found in a return to indigenous ways. For it seemed to some that the hour of the apocalypse was near. The forests and plains were purged of their creatures, villages annihilated by plague, and survivors cast out of their homelands. Hope yet remained among Joseph and his people. Their scouts knew Howard would be weeks behind their trail. They were unaware that the frontier forts of the United States had been summoned against them. The band set their teepees at the foot of a tall slope along the Big Hole River. That night, over 100 American forces crept close enough, they later told, to hear dogs barking and Nez Perce babies crying. Just before dawn on August 9th, the soldiers advanced, instructed to aim low into the teepees to kill people as they slept. They raked fire at the fleeing Nez Perce. A boy hiding in the nearby stream with his mother recalled, "One little girl held her arm up from the cold water. It was a big bullet hole. I could see through it." The Nez Perce warriors struck back, killed many attackers, and repulsed them to the woods. A lengthy sniping battle covered the retreat of the Nez Perce caravan. The Americans had managed to kill 60 to 90 Nez Perce, including many women and children. 6 attackers would receive medals of honor. The shaken Nez Perce questioned the military leadership of Lookingglass, but it was he who, 10 days later, led an attack directly on Howard's camp, stealing over 100 mules and horses. Having failed again to capture his targets, Howard grew weary, and he was chided by Commanding General of the Army William T. Sherman for his lack of resolve. The Nez Perce trekked ahead into stranger parts, known to some in those days as the Land of the Burning Ground, the recently established Yellowstone National Park. The trees, birds, and all the creatures grew and lived in the lush ruins of an earthen tower 40 miles across, the caldera of a supervolcano not truly awoken in 600,000 years. One could still recall when herds of bison rumbled past the sparkling salvos of its geysers, and grizzlies and moose lumbered across the wooded hills, and wolf dens stirred at the approach of outsiders. The forest now stood quieter. Animals along the frontier had been variously trapped, shot, and poisoned. General Sherman wrote with satisfaction that the sudden depopulation of animals had starved Native Americans from their homelands on the nearby plains and cleared the land for settlement and industry. This vast region has undergone in the past 10 years a more violent and radical change than any like space of the Earth's surface during any previous 50 years. The game is nearly all gone. The Indian has been forced onto small reservations. I can bear personal testimony that where in 1868 millions of buffalo could be found, not a single one is now seen. While the wildlife of Yellowstone would one day flourish again, for now the park was a place to hide. Over the next 2 weeks, the main caravan took tourist parties captive to cover their whereabouts before releasing them with food and directions. But small bands of Nez Perce warriors, furious over the massacre at Big Hole, broke off, robbed, and attacked several tourists, to the condemnation of Chief Joseph. Looking Glass meanwhile made contact with the Crow, who declined his request for help. They would not risk defying the United States. The last hope lay far north. Hounded by American forces after his triumph at Little Bighorn a year ago, Lakota Chief Sitting Bull and some of his followers had fled to Canada. Parts patrolled only by mounted police who lacked the power to extradite armed indigenous warriors. Whitebird had long advocated that the Nez Perce seek refuge with Sitting Bull, and the Council of Chiefs now agreed. The prospect of such an alliance had occurred to Howard, but General Philip Sheridan assured him that the idea was ridiculous. While Howard trailed the Nez Perce, additional forces under Colonel Sturgis angled to cut them off. Threading the jagged Clark's Fork Canyon, the Nez Perce then ascended the great rock walls, milled their horses in a circle to conceal their trail, and feinted south. Sturgis pursued the false trail, only to find that the Nez Perce had cut back north into the canyon and escaped onto the plains. Sturgis reached them on September 13th, and with the help of the Crow, managed to capture many horses, but the Nez Perce killed several of his men and escaped into the night. The long days of riding ahead were punctuated by fearful nights on the quiet expanse. Around Cow Island, the hungry Nez Perce skirmished with soldiers and plundered supplies from a steamboat landing and a wagon train. The winds grew cold as they trekked north. The horses were hurting, the people still grieving. Looking Glass insisted they pitch their tattered tents in the foothills of the Bear Paw Mountains. Over 1,000 miles and 4 months behind them, the Nez Perce sat 40 miles from the border. But the capable Colonel Nelson A. Miles, who had routed bands of Lakota over the last year, had tracked them with a large force, bolstered by Cheyenne scouts. On September 30th, Miles' men stormed the camp, fired on defenders, and captured most of the horses. Some Nez Perce managed to flee north, but most were pinned down as warriors traded kills with the enemy, who then established positions around the camp. Among the dead were TooHoolhoolzote and Joseph's brother Ollicott. Snow fell that night. It shrouded the corpses of kinfolk while the living burrowed into holes, and warriors kept guard in rifle pits. Artillery pounded the hills. Many hoped that those who fled north would return with Sitting Bull and the Lakota and scatter the Americans. Looking Glass rose to scan the faint edges of the battlefield for rescuers, and an American soldier shot him in the head. The cold stalemate lasted for days. Howard arrived in Miles' camp late on October 4th. While each side had killed around 25 of the other, the Nez Perce people were ailing. The next day, flanked by 5 companions, Chief Joseph rode over the White Hills, his rifle across his lap. He met with Miles and Howard, and it was recorded that he surrendered with the words, "I'm tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. Looking Glass is dead. TooHoolhoolzote is dead. The old men are all dead. He who leads the young men is dead. The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them, have run away to the hills and have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are. I want time to look for my children and see how many of them I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." Whitebird would escape north with some followers. In all, around 200 reached Sitting Bull's camp. Joseph and many others could have escaped if they had been willing to abandon the young, wounded, and elderly, but they were not. The 400 or so who surrendered at the Battle of Bear Paw did so with the understanding that they would move to the Nez Perce reservation, the remaining sliver of their homeland. But Sherman overruled Miles and sent the prisoners to Indian Territory, a bleak spot of land among other removed peoples such as the Comanche and Osage. Days after the end of the war, the New York Times published the following. "We freely express the opinion that the Nez Perce War was, on the part of our government, an unpardonable and frightful blunder, a crime whose victims alike are the hundreds of our gallant officers and men, and the peaceful bands who were goaded by injustice and wrong to the warpath." The belief that the Nez Perce had been cheated of their homeland and unjustly hunted by the US was not the tendentious making of later revisionists, but in fact a prevailing view among the American public during and after the war. Sherman conceded that the Nez Perce had fought humanely and displayed a courage and skill that elicited universal praise. Chief Joseph became a national figure. He delivered speeches in the Capitol and tearfully pleaded for a return to his homeland. The Nez Perce had lost up to 150 people during the war. Within just 3 years of exile, limited rations and lack of medicine contributed to 150 more deaths. They would lose almost every young child, including Joseph's daughter. Howard wrote to Joseph, "I have much compassion for you. I feel sorry that so many have sickened and died." And Miles, who insisted that indigenous people needed to be civilized, lamented, "We have carried on a cruel, relentless war of extermination against the Indian." Most who had escaped to Canada made their way back to the United States, and in 1885 the Nez Perce and Indian Territory were permitted to return to the Northwest. Though fragmented and resigned to reservations, the Nez Perce would survive. Barred from even the Nez Perce reservation, Chief Joseph was exiled to the Colville Reservation. The dream of regaining the land of his father remained a dream. He died on the Colville Reservation in 1904. "It is often wondered at by the general public why we should have Indian wars," wrote General Sheridan a year after the Nez Perce surrendered. Sheridan, having overseen the removal of thousands of indigenous people across the American West, offered no sermon about westward destiny, but addressed the matter frankly. "We took away their country and their means of support, broke up their mode of living, their habits of life, introduced disease and decay among them, and it was for this and against this they made war. Could anyone expect less?" When Joe's making a painting like this, he needs a certain peace of mind, but the unsettling reality is that the internet is flooded with data brokers, corporations that crawl the web searching for information they use to build a profile of you with things like social security numbers, birthdays, addresses, information about your relatives, and more. That's why I'm glad to partner with Delete Me. It's incredibly simple and effective. Their privacy experts work all year long to remove your info from search results posted by hundreds of data brokers. I love that in just 7 days I get a privacy report showing proof that Delete Me is working. The number of sites and personal details they've removed and the names of data brokers I no longer need to worry about. That's right, as data brokers change their tactics, Delete Me keeps monitoring them and repeats removals as needed. Delete Me is the gold standard for protecting your privacy, and since you're a History Dose viewer, you get 20% off Delete Me US consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/historydose and use the promo code HistoryDose at checkout.